So if you're watching on the live stream, you're only going to see the slides. And you don't get to see my mug today because that's too hard for me to run back and forth and change the slides in the camera. And we won't even try that. And so I mentioned the lunch in the Bible mobile. So what we're doing today is how the Bible came to be. And our first session in that 4-week series is going to be looking at what we call the Old Testament. And this is very important. Anytime, stop me for a question. There is no such thing as a dumb question. No such thing. And I almost guarantee if you're the one that's brave enough to ask it, somebody else is going, thank you. Right. And if it's something that I'm going to hit as we travel along, I'll make note and we'll make sure we answer it. So, it's very easy for us to assume that this book we call the Holy Bible has always been this way, because this is the only way we've ever known it. A whole library. The word Bible comes from the Greek ta biblia, which means the books, plural. It's actually a way of calling this a library full of smaller books or letters or whatever you want to call it. We've always taken for granted, we can easily take for granted, it's always been these 66 books for us in our own language, all nicely organized by book titles, chapters and verses, and so on and so on and so on. And we take it for granted that the church has always had this Bible, but that's not the case. We're going to explore that because there was a time when we had church and we had no Bible. We had no New Testament at all, and we had no Bible in a technical sense, and we'll probably talk about that more next time. And, you know, God didn't announce from on high so many books and so on and so on. This has been the product. What we call our Bible as Christians is the product of the church's work. It's a human endeavor to assemble this book so that we have it to use to encounter and connect with God. Speaking of encountering God, I want to start with this story about Moses. As you know, Moses was charged with leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Before that, well, the event where that happened is the burning bush, of course. And they're underway, they've crossed the Red Sea, they're on their way to the Promised Land, but things are going badly. They haven't got more than a few verses out of the Red Sea when they're complaining about being hungry and thirsty, and the people are stiff-necked, hard-headed, complainers all the way through. And you get to Exodus 33, and God is just ready to blow them all up, except for one. He said, I'll take you, Moses, and start over. And Moses says, dude, you don't want to do that. Do you want to be known as the God who led a people out of slavery and just nuked them in the desert? You don't want to be that. God changed God's mind at that point. But along the way, Moses says, I've worked with you so far. I've been through a lot. I'd like to see who I work for. Show me your glory, Moses says. God says, you can't see my glory and live, but I've got such a deal for you. I'm going to put you in this little cleft of the rock here, and my glory is going to pass by. You can't see my face, but you can see my back. So Moses gets to see God's back. I'll always be indebted to Dr. Roland Gold, my Old Testament prof in seminary, who unpacked that story for us and said, and I'm paraphrasing him and doing my own thing. You know how if you've ever stood close enough to the railroad tracks that when a train goes by, it's when it's past it you feel the wind hit you, right? Most of us, maybe all of us, never see God coming at us on approach. But when God's been there, it's like, what was that? And we see God's back. A related story. One day in May of 1991, the call committee at Salem Lutheran Church in Glendale, California, dropped by the office of their then associate pastor, me, to let him know that they had decided to look elsewhere for a senior pastor when that opportunity came vacant. Let's just say that was a bit of an earthquake in our household at the time. Fast forward 1 year, the now new senior pastor at Mount Cross Lutheran Church in Camarillo, California, about 60 miles away, me, could look back on that event and go, oh, now I see how this fits together in the plan, okay? So what we're going to be doing together in this series is kind of doing a little looking back to see the kind of a detective story, if you will, putting the clues together, the pieces of evidence together that have been left behind. There's a lot of pieces of evidence in this particular story. And look at the way that the Spirit of God has led a lot of different people to witness to God's work and glory and power in their lives and in the lives of the community. And eventually, long story short, get to the Bible that we're familiar with. So, we're going to go way back to the very, very, very beginning. And I'm not going to argue with you whether you believe the universe is 13-some billion years old, or, according to Bishop Ussher, you ever heard of Bishop Ussher? Episcopal or Anglican bishop back in the 1500s took the Bible and all the available history that he could find and backdated to October 23rd, 4004 BC was the date of creation. Okay, so there's people that hold that view. I don't care. I don't care which you hold. The only one who was able to witness that event would be God, God's own self. Okay? Now, Moses is traditionally credited with the authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible. That's fine. That's fine. But no matter what date you choose, Moses is simply not old enough to be the one to witness creation, even if it's 6,000 years BC, okay, or 4,000 BC. Because we know that Moses, at the time he was tasked with taking the Israelites out of Egypt, was 80 years old at that point. So there's no way he was old enough to watch it. So the question is, if he's the author, how does he write about it? Several choices are there for you. One is, God said, I'll take care of it. I'll just grab your hand, you hold the pen, and I will dictate, and I will not even dictate, I'll just guide the words to be written on whatever you're writing it on. That's fine. Another option would be for God to send an angelic presence, either direct like this picture, or somehow God dictated every word that God wanted written down in those books. That's fine too. Or Moses, maybe that's his sister, like a lot of people then and now, have gone outside at night and looked up at the sky, even before the James Webb telescope got us better pictures of the sky, and wondered, who did all this, you know? And who made me? And who's in charge of all this and all that? And so, not wanting to leave us in the dark, I was in a conversation recently where we were on 2 different not pages, but 2 different perspectives on how the Bible is God's word. And I was asked, do you believe the Bible's inspired? I said, I absolutely do. I believe that God didn't want to leave us in the dark about these big questions. So in whatever means God employed, those who gazed at the stars and have experienced these things were inspired by God's Spirit to put that witness, to begin to tell that witness, I should say, because we're not to the point of writing it down yet, not even close. So these stories, these accounts of sensing that we've encountered God, there's no writing yet. It's too early for that in human history. We're talking, well, maybe not for all of human history, but for the history we're talking about. How do we tell the story? We tell it around the campfire. Maybe they have a lute or some instrument, or maybe they just sing it in a song form. Maybe it's in a poem form. And you know very well the way poetry protects itself in its transmission next to next to next. Roses are red, violets are blue, and so are you. Sugar is sweet. Wait. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. The form of that little ditty protects its transmission, because if you get it wrong, you know you got it wrong. It's just out of whack. It's like jokes. Ever gotten the punchline out of place in a joke? You know you blew it, right? The form of the literature, if you want to call it that, the form of the joke, the poem, protects its transmission to the next, to the next. What's the best way to remember a good joke? tell it right away to somebody else. Then you've reinforced it in your own, and you've passed it along. One could say the same thing about witnessing for Christ, right? So you've got some choices. I'm not going to try and bend your arm to say this or that. I'll just say what I appreciated reading in our book that many of us who are here read this last summer was this quote from John Pavlovich about how he doesn't see the Bible as divine dictation, but as the journal entries of those who came before me, who have walked this road of asking, seeking, and knocking, not a road map, but a traveling companion. I like that. I like that. Not everybody will like that. I'm okay with that. So, so far about how the story gets started. Any comments, questions? I'm going to try to leave a lot of space for discussion. Okay. Which is a tradition, if you will, that we keep alive in our life as Christians in worship. We tell the same stories. Those of us who grew up on the service book and hymnal had a one-year lectionary, so every year we hit the same Bible passages as we went through. So, yeah. Any other? Okay. Yeah. No. So I just pitched everything I was going to teach them, and I went to all the Bible stories. Oh, yeah? And they loved it. Oh, yeah. So, here's a rough timeline. Now, don't quote me on the dates. All the scholars argue about all this stuff. I don't care. But this is a kind of a general outline of how things are rolling. At the top where it says Abraham in quotes, that refers to everything from the stories of creation up until, shall we say, the start of the reign of King Saul, roughly 1000 BC. There's no evidence that there is anything, what we call Bible, written down prior to about 1000 BC. So for all that period of time, maybe 1,000 years, what we've got are the oral tradition, passed along. And then by the time we get the monarchy with King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and so on, that's when the Bible starts to become history. I mean, documented historical events, some of which you can actually connect to historical writings outside the Bible, which is always a discovery, a cool discovery for the Bible people, because they can verify, yeah, that happened, and so on. Then they start getting written down, and in that period of time between 1000 BC and 400 BC also happens the recognition that some of these things that we've written down and are starting to collect are to be honored, revered, regarded as holy, inspired. I don't know what terms they would have used in those days. But for example, King Josiah in the 600s undertook to reform. If you've ever read the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, you know that just about every single one of them sinned worse than the one before, and things got bad. Josiah was one of the better ones. He tried to reform. He did some work, and somebody found a book in the temple. Could be that what they found was the Torah, the first 5 books. We'll get to that in a minute. And they brought that out, and it was like, oh my gosh, look at this. We have to honor this by obeying what it says. So even in that period at 600 BC, there was a recognition, this is not just regular literature. This is something that we have to honor and obey and so on. And then those writings are now being collected starting in 600 BC, as I mentioned, that discovery of what probably was the Torah, or 5 scrolls perhaps, collected together, and by the time we get to the time of Jesus, there are three distinct categories of writings that have been produced. We're going to get to that in just a second. And eventually, they have to decide what is going to be their canon. We'll talk about canon in a little bit. We don't have anything close to the copy that Moses wrote for the first time of the book of Genesis. Let's assume he's the author, or Exodus, or any of those books. We don't have any of Isaiah's autographed copies. We don't have any first editions, okay? All we have is copies. All we have is copies. And, yeah. I can go back a slide. Yeah. The tradition is that Moses wrote it.
But Moses would have lived like closer to Abraham, right?
Correct. Yeah, put Moses dates at about 1400 BC. So that was God's writing. Written with God's finger, it says. Somehow they discerned what was written there in whatever language it was, but we don't have those anymore. They were put in the Ark of the Covenant, which when Indiana Jones opened it up, they weren't there. And the actual story about the whereabouts of that ark are subject to all kinds of traditions. Some say it's still buried under Jerusalem. I started writing a novel once which had it taken off to Persia and buried in one of the king's tombs. So we don't know. So, oh yeah, absolutely. And the way that they came, remember when Charlton Heston's holding the tablets, and he wasn't holding them, they were blasted out of the mountain and then popped loose, and he could carry them down and then throw them and break them and start all over. Not quite, yeah. So yeah, again, we read into, because there's so many gaps. People have, and we're going to talk about this in week 3 especially, people hate gaps when it comes to this stuff, and so they'll fill the gaps to suit their anxiety, I guess. So we don't have any autographed copies. This is part of a letter, letters that were written on pieces of clay pottery, which were written during the time that Nebuchadnezzar was laying siege to Jerusalem. That's about the time of this. It's some of the earliest ancient Hebrew writing that exists. If the Bible existed in writing form at that time, it might have looked something like this, but who knows? We don't have any Bibles from 600 BC. We just don't. We don't have any scrolls of Genesis or the Pentateuch or any of that from that far back. What we do have, and for a long time, this was the oldest complete Hebrew Bible that anybody knew about. I think it's kept in the British Museum now. But that's 1000 AD. That's a long way from King Saul and everything that happened. And it was the best they had until 1947. The story changes in 1947. Anybody been to the Holy Land? Not anybody. Well, if you ever go, make sure your tour includes Qumran, that red dot near the Dead Sea. Qumran was a community, I'll compare it to the Amish, speaking of Amish furniture. The Amish, as you know, have basically tried to turn their back on our polluted society so they can keep the faith. There were a group of Jews who felt the same about Jerusalem. The town is just too unholy for us to stay faithful to Torah, so we're getting out of Dodge. We're going to go build ourselves a community by the Dead Sea and be very ascetic, very disciplined, and anticipate the coming of Messiah by keeping Torah in a pure fashion. And they had developed a library of Bible and other writings. Just like if you walked into a Christian bookstore today, you'd find a Bible section, but you'd also find a lot of other topics. You'd find that in their library too. However, with the start of the Jewish revolt against the Roman occupation in the late 60s into the 70s, they feared for their library, so they ran it up into the hills and hid it in caves where it stayed. The Romans came through and demolished Jerusalem, demolished the temple. Perhaps they demolished Qumran at the same time. We're not sure exactly about that. Meanwhile, their library was tucked away in these mountain caves for all the years until the story is told this shepherd was chasing his sheep around, or goats, and he threw a rock into one of these caves and heard a clink. What was that? Went up there and found all these stone jars, and inside of them, lo and behold, scrolls of the Bible. Now, this is probably the most beautiful example of what they found. An Isaiah scroll, and they've carbon dated it or whatever method they use to about 200 BC. So all of a sudden you see we've moved way back in time, much closer to the events that it records. You can see that it's stitched together on that right side. You can see it's animal skin is what they wrote on. You can see how it's been used because the grease, the oil from the hands is on the roll. And so that now moves our ability to check the text so much earlier. Unfortunately, not everything they found looked like that. Some of it looked like that. Oh, there's a couple of hunks missing. Some of it looked like that. Oh, there's a whole big gap there. Some of it looks like that. And some of it looks like that. Imagine discovering a whole pile of jigsaw pieces on the floor, but discovering after you start looking at them, they don't all go to the same puzzle. So they might find a letter or two letters on one of those pieces, and there might not be anything on the back because they didn't usually write on the back of the scrolls. So there's thousands of pieces that they have to try and use, but the process has been going on ever since to restore what they have found and try to come up with accurate copies. Now, one reason that this is so exciting is that one from 1000 AD and that one from 200 BC, nearly identical. And as I understand it, the way that Hebrew scribes copied the scrolls, if he was tasked with copying Isaiah, he would roll out the one he's copying from, and they would count all the letters. And then they would find the middle letter, mark that. The scribe would finish writing out the copy, count all the letters, find the middle letter. If they didn't agree, throw it out and start over. Picture that. So that's why there's such accuracy in these ancient manuscripts, because there was such fastidious attention to the detail of their copying, because they didn't have any Xerox machines for a while. So anything about that section, about the earliest documents?
So is there still today, people trying to interpret and put back together Dead Sea Scrolls?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a whole museum dedicated to this in Jerusalem. And I think it actually is built in the form of a scroll, if I recall. They continue to find Bible manuscripts in all kinds of places. I think they're still finding stuff in the Dead Sea area where Qumran was. We're going to talk about that too. Yeah. But also for both Old and New Testament manuscripts, they find them in the strangest places, including as insulation in the walls of monasteries and all kinds of weird places. Yeah, if it was worn out, they would just use it that way, and I don't know. Yeah, right. So I don't think in the BC era or even in the early centuries, but more recently, this word Tanakh is a shorthand way. Of course, understand, the Jews don't call theirs the Old Testament. We understand that. Okay. I will try to always refer to it as the Hebrew Bible. And they will sometimes use this word Tanakh, which is short for Torah, T, Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for prophets, and Ketubim, which is the Hebrew word for the writings. So T and K, they fill in some vowels, becomes Tanakh. And so in their Bible, now this is how you will find it. Here's my copy of the Hebrew Bible. This book is really special to me because when I was a pastor in Glendale working with the deaf, long story short, I helped to take care of a deaf man who had a lot of challenges. And before I left to take my new call, he inscribed it in the back. But he inscribed it in Hebrew fashion, meaning he wrote from right to left. So it says, to Reverend John Soyster and so on. But anyway, that's a modern edition of the best scholarship available at the time of its printing of what all the ancient manuscripts are available, can produce. Look that over afterwards. So their Bible and our Bible, identical as it gets started. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's, when some people use the word Torah, they sometimes mean the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures, but more precisely it means those first 5 books. And the word Pentateuch is also used, which is a Greek word for 5 books. Okay. Correct. The contents of those 5 books are the same as the Bibles we would have in our hands or in the pews and so on. Next comes what they call the prophets, and you're going to look right away and go, oh, I'm used to calling those history, some of those. Joshua, that's the conquest, Judges. Samuel, we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, that's one book for them. We have 1st and 2nd Kings, that's one book for them. And then comes, pardon me? Don't get ahead of me. These are the prophets. And then, of course, we get the big 3, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then comes number 8, all this other guys. Now, how come Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel each get their own number, but the last bunch doesn't? They're the minor prophets. And they're not minor because their message is less important. It's because Isaiah will take an entire 60-foot scroll to complete. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the same. You can put all 12 minor prophets on one scroll. So they're just minor as in short, okay? So they equal one book, basically, in the Hebrew Bible, you might say. Then comes the writings. That's where Ruth shows up, finally. You'll be glad to know. Some of these are, of course, the Psalms, Proverbs, and so on are different poetry and wisdom. Some of those are what we would think of as history. But they didn't consider Ruth a prophet in the same sense. And where Ezra and Nehemiah in our Bible is 2 books, they make it 1. Chronicles is 2 books, they make it 1. So when you add all those up, 5 books, 8 books, 11 books, the Hebrew Bible only has 24 books. But the contents of their Bible, although they appear in a different order in a book like this, same contents as we're used to. So we say 39, they say 24. It's tomato, okay? Questions about how they put their book together. Right. Yeah, they were first, so we changed it.
Why do we change it to what it is? Is it more chronological or something?
That's a good question, which I'm going to write down. I don't know what I did with my pen. There it is. Why did we change the order? You're getting ahead of me. Can't I just Google that? So, was there?
So you said there's 2 different versions, content is the same.
2 different orders.
Okay.
The order of the books is different, but the contents of all those books in the Hebrew Bible are the same as our Old Testament.
So those 2 orders are found in the same geographical place? In this place by the Dead Sea? Or were they found? The reason I'm asking the question is I'm trying to know if these stories were told in 2 different geographical places, but they ended up being the same stories. That's what I'm trying to find out. Or
order of the books in the,
It wasn't two different,
it's like if you go into a library that uses the Dewey Decimal System, and then you go into a library that uses the Library of Congress system, it's the same books, they're just ordered differently.
okay, written by the same,
The contents, the understanding of who wrote them, Isaiah is Isaiah is Isaiah, and theirs and ours, no difference. It's just that they chose initially to list Samuel, Kings, Joshua, Judges as what they called prophets in a way that we would call history. So ours is more of a chronological order. When you read through, after Deuteronomy, which is when they are on the verge, Moses dies looking into the promised land at the end of Deuteronomy. Joshua takes them in. Okay, Ruth fits in that story, so she's back in historical order more or less, and so on. So that's probably what happened.
I was just trying to find out if the same story is being told.
Yeah.
5,000 miles apart by different people.
No. No.
So,
Oh.
this just occurs to me.
Yeah.
I guess I always was under the impression that the Dead Sea Scrolls were new information. Is there some that was new
Yes.
information?
Thank you for mentioning that. What they found there was Bible, but also this other religious literature. As I recall, one of the works that they found is called the War Between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, an apocalyptic type book. They were out there both to be away from the pollution of the city, but also as a way to prepare for the end times that they felt were upon us. And this kind of writing was somewhat probably like the book of Revelation. Okay, we got to get ready for the end. So yes, there were the other religious literature that was found there, and other literature that maybe even wasn't religious is very useful, because if I was to find a novel, let's say, in that library, and I found expressions, idioms, for example, that were used in literature, secular literature, the phrasing also occurs in the Bible, I get an insight onto how idioms are used in the Bible. I've used this example almost forever. In the book of Amos, I think there's a place where God says, "And I will give them cleanness of teeth." Cleanness of teeth is an idiom for famine. If your teeth are clean, it's because no food's gone in your mouth. Famine. Oh, not family, no. So if we could spread out Bibles right now and look that up, all translators have to decide, am I going to translate the literal text? Or having discovered that this idiom is in play in their language, am I going to translate the idiom into famine instead of cleanness of teeth? So different translations make different choices. And that's why knowing the original languages is always a help, because you can, another good example, no, I'm not going to tell that one because we're going to use that one on Bible Sunday, Bible Saturday and Bible Sunday, the last weekend of this month. We're going to take a little time to play with this during worship. Just a very short illustration, but I almost gave it away. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and it probably depends on the edition too, because the one that I have here was actually produced in Germany, and it's got several different languages of introductions: French, German, Italian, English. But we've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numeri, Deuteronomium. Joshua is spelled Josua. Kings is spelled Reges. Regis, like king, regal. Okay. So you'll see some different names, but that's mostly just a translation issue. Then doesn't refer to anything different in the contents. You could figure it out. Yeah. But you probably noticed a different order if you were looking carefully. because you would find after Joshua Judges, you wouldn't see Ruth. You'd start to see Samuel and Kings, for example. So things are rolling merrily along for the Jews into the first century, the time of Jesus. This is a facsimile of what the temple looked like at the time of Christ. King Herod, the Herod who slaughtered the innocents, the second temple was rebuilt after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed it, and it was okay. They were using it, but when Herod came along, and he reigned, I think, starting in 37 BC. He undertook a big remodeling and upgrading, and the place was spectacular. And so this is the heart of the Jewish people right there. And the heart of the heart was their sacrificial system. That's how they connected with God, with the sacrifices of thanksgiving and of sin and all those kind of things. That all changed in the year AD 70 when Titus, the Roman general, marched in, and at the culmination, not quite the ending, of this Jewish revolt against the Roman occupation, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. And all that's left is the Wailing Wall, if you've heard of that. So now their heart has been ripped out as a religious people, as a nation. Who are we now? If we're not the people that focuses on the whole sacrificial system, who are we? And so, long story short, they had to redefine themselves as the people of the book, or probably better, people of the scroll. Good morning. Because even to this day, if you get a chance to visit, how many have visited a synagogue? A couple people. You'll know they have what they call the bima, which is this big desk, and on it they unroll the scroll. They still use scrolls for worship today. And when you get your bar mitzvah or your bat mitzvah, you go up to read the scroll. You take a little pointer that's got a little finger on the end. It's probably made out of silver. And that's what you use to find your way across the page, because you don't put the oil of your finger on one of those scrolls. Never, never. And so they still use the scroll to this day, even though at the time, what's known as a codex, books were becoming a thing by this time. Books are so cool. Can you imagine if you're doing a Bible study in John 3:16, and I suddenly say, oh, that reminds me of something in John 21. Just a minute. What a pain. So books were cool. You just flip, and I'm there. Okay. So,
The scrolls they get today in the synagogues, are they just purchased, like manufactured, or
oh no, they're copied.
they're copied?
Those are hand copied. Yeah, you can't find a printer that will run one of those off. Now, I don't have it here. Did I bring it?
How many are there of those?
Well, that's what keeps the scribes in business, for sure. So here's the Holy Scriptures. This is according to the Masoretic text. That's a long story, but that's the accepted, shall we say, final version of the Hebrew Scriptures in a book form. Okay? And I'm pretty sure this is produced by the Jewish Publication Society. And Genesis, Exodus. Oh, this is topical. All right. Yep, it's the same order that we were seeing on the screen earlier. So anybody can look at these and we'll finish. That was one of the, if there was a threat to your town, the first thing that left was the scroll to be protected. And if you Google sometimes synagogue scrolls or something, it's a rabbit hole, because there's so many interesting stories about the provenance and the history of some of these scrolls. Some of them are old and have been protected for hundreds of years as they were brought from different places and protected. Yeah, if a scroll burned, that would be a tragedy. That would be a tragedy. But if a new synagogue was formed, they would have to find either a way for somebody to donate one or to have one copied for their place.
Are there actually scribes, as in, the scribes of the Pharisees?
Yes, I think they still do that. Yeah, they're still doing that. That's their job. Yeah. So, who are we? I put that up there just because When we talk about canon, we're not talking about explosions. Take out one end, and we talk about the collection of writings that a community, in this case the Jews, consider to be authoritative, inspired, divinely inspired, and which will be in the books that are going to be included in our Bible. So they had to wrestle with this question, because now we're the people of the book. I'll keep using that phrase, even though we know it's not really a book. So a lot of people used to believe that whole decision was made in the year AD 90 in a seaside town known as Jamnia or Yavne. Not every scholar agrees with that. I don't care. Fact is, at some point, they finally did decide what's in and what's not, because there were some questions about what shouldn't get in. And that leads to what I've been showing you. They made a decision. Those 24 books are going to be in, and here's why. We're only letting stuff in that was originally written in Hebrew and has a tradition that we estimate dates no later than 400 BC. That's how I understand their decision. It may have been more complicated than that, but that was how they settled, part of how they settled the matter. And some of that question face was going to clarify in a minute. Which, however the process happened, there probably were some interesting discussions about what should be in and what should be out. I can't imagine being a Jew terribly well, but as a Christian, I read the book of Ecclesiastes and go, what is this doing in the Bible? Vanity of vanity, all is vanities. And the bigger question probably arose with the book of Esther. Guess what word never appears in the book of Esther? God. What? How are we going to let in a book that doesn't have the word God? I think the reason it got in is by this time in history, 90, the first century of AD, some writings you'll see CE for Common Era. I don't use that. Academians use it. I don't use that. By this time, there was a Jewish festival known as Purim, which was a fun one. Passover, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, those are a little, well, Rosh Hashanah is a big one. That's New Year, but Yom Kippur, definitely a quiet, dark. But Purim was fun because it's the story of Esther, who helped to avert genocide of the Jewish people by the Persians. And so they celebrate. And I got a story, but I'll tell it some other time about that one. Celebrate, and they eat special baked goods, and they act out the story. And the enemy in the story is Haman. And every time he comes on the scene in the play, they'll hiss and boo, kind of like an old melodrama. So it's a fun celebration. It was already in play, so they figured we got to keep Esther in the Bible because we got this. We don't want to lose our festival. That's how I understand it. That's how I understand it. What? I don't know about moneymaker, but it was just too much fun to let go of. Because there's the Festival of Booths, which is, you're supposed to go outside and build a little shelter and sleep outside for a week. Oh, that's fun. So, and that's in October, I think, if I recall. So anyway, so that's what got everything, that's the decisions they made. So we'll stop again if there's questions about, you've been stopping me along the way, which is great, so that I don't really need these slides. So, we're going to send the clock back a little ways. Because everything we've talked about from the time of the first writings, give or take 1000 BC, up until the cutoff, 400 BC or so, when we're getting a little closer to the zero date, if you will, it's all been in Hebrew. That's fine. That's fine. But in that period of time, 300, 200, 100, a lot of Jews aren't reading Hebrew anymore. The reason being is that Greek has become the common language of the ancient world around which we're speaking. I don't think they were speaking Greek in North America at that time, but in the areas that we're concerned about, Greek had become the language of culture and of commerce, And a whole lot of Jews were saying, we can't read our Bible anymore. We don't understand Hebrew. So, decision was made to translate the Bible. And the tradition goes like this. We got to get the Hebrew Bible translated into another language, Greek. And that's no small thing, because when you move from a different language, you move from it to a different worldview, a different everything. Okay, it's a big challenge. So let's make sure we get it right. They called 70 Jewish scholars together who knew Greek. And they sent them all off on their own with a copy of the Hebrew Bible. And they said, give us a translation. They brought all 70 copies back together, and they were all exactly the same. That's the tradition. Which is why the Bible is called the Septuagint, which is the Greek word for 70, abbreviated LXX. Okay. So this is the Bible of the disciples of Jesus, probably. Jesus, as a rabbi, he knew the Hebrew. But the disciples, if they knew any Bible, it was probably this one. An example, Isaiah, I didn't think I wrote this down, but I think I remember it. Isaiah says, a voice cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Matthew says, a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Okay? So it's close. And sometimes these guys were probably working by memory when they wrote some of that stuff down. Not a big deal, but it's an interesting variation. So, we've got now, in the end of the BC era, this new translation of the Bible in Greek, which is very valuable. However, there's stuff that's in that edition that isn't in the Hebrew Bible. Some of it is other literature, traditional stories about people like Judith and, where'd she go? Tobit, okay? And you probably never heard of Bel and the Dragon or the Prayer of Manasseh. This is literature that was religious literature, some of it historical, 1, 2, 3, 4 Maccabees, that's interesting stuff, that was originally written in Greek in this time period when Hebrew was no longer the lingua franca and they were writing out these stories and traditions in Greek now. Well, you remember, they said nothing gets in our Bible if it's not in Hebrew, so these don't make the Hebrew Bible, the one that the Jews have in their synagogues. Many of those books do end up in the Roman Catholic Bible and in some editions of Bibles like this one. This has what we call Old Testament, New Testament, and Apocrypha. We're going to get to that in a second. So in that, there, I got a copy of that too. Septuaginta. And so it's all here in Greek instead of Hebrew.
You said the 70 guys took the Hebrew Bible, came back together, and they were all translated the same, but they came up with all these extra books, all of them?
Well, those books found their way in some way. And that's another good question. What's the difference between what they took to copy and what ended up in the Septuagint? Yes, very sharp eye there. And I don't know that part of the story. Except some of these events maybe were actually after the Septuagint was first produced. For case in point, First Maccabees. The empire that was Alexander the Great's, when he died, was chopped into 4 quarters. And the quarter in the southeast, which included Palestine, Israel, was given to a guy named Antiochus. He ruled it with an iron fist. He made, I don't know if his seat of power was in Jerusalem, but that was part of his territory. And so he decided, I want worship. I'm going to have worship of me in the temple in Jerusalem. I'm going to have pigs offered as sacrifice to me in the temple in Jerusalem. And he decided he would have a new nickname. He would call himself Epiphanes, which means the light. And so you can guess the Jews weren't happy with all that. So there was a revolt led by the Maccabees, and they ultimately defeat Antiochus. They cleanse the temple. They get ready to rededicate it. They light the lights in the temple, and they've only got enough oil for one night. But it miraculously lasts for all 8. You know what I'm talking about? Hanukkah. That's where that tradition comes from in Maccabees. Well, that story pushes much closer to the 0 of BC. So it probably, and some of these others maybe too. So that's probably how they snuck in. So, so some traditions, like the Roman Catholic, include those as sacred scripture. Some, like Luther, he thought they were interesting for historical purposes, but they didn't I don't believe he didn't translate those in his first edition. They've appeared in later Lutheran Bibles of the 16 and 1700s, but not in Luther's as I understand it. So I used that word apocrypha. I just wanted to take a moment to clarify the difference between apocrypha and apocalypse, because they sound very similar, okay? Apocrypha is a word that means dubious. Sometimes people will translate it as hidden, as if these books that were all in orange there are somehow mysterious, the lost books of the Bible. You'll see Discovery Channel specials on stuff like this, the lost books of the Bible. Give me a break. They're not lost. People have known about them for centuries. They just weren't deemed sacred scripture by the Jews, that's all. They refer in some cases to, as it says, books included in the Septuagint and the Vulgate. That's the Latin translation of the scriptures from the Roman Catholic Church, but excluded from Jewish and Protestant canons. B is also a Christian apocrypha, writings that would have loved to have been in the New Testament, but were not in. That's our story for next time. And that's a fun one. That's a fun one. So, apocalypse, that's a word that means to reveal. The last book of the Bible in Greek is called the Apocalypse of John, the Revelation of John. And that's what it means. It's also, the word apocalyptic is used for a type of literature which Revelation is. Usually, the situation is so bad, no human effort could fix it. It requires intervention from God's perspective, and that's what Revelation's all about. So it's a style of literature, apocalyptic, but an apocalypse is a revelation, a prophetic revelation of some kind. So they sound similar at the start, but they're 2 very different words. Anything on your mind about anything I've thrown at you? Yeah, part of the reason for this series is to, you may or may not believe in Darwinian evolution, but you kind of have to believe in the evolution of the Bible, because it just, like I said, it did not fall from God in this form. It has a long, interesting, complicated story that we haven't totally figured out yet either. Yes, it's the inspired witness of fellow travelers who traveled long before us and their experience of God. And I believe God, as I said earlier, didn't want to leave us in the lurch as far as, and I used the word who at the beginning especially. Who is responsible for all this? Who is responsible for me? Who is responsible for this gathering known as Israel, or later the gathering known as the church. I use the word who a lot when talking about the Bible. I don't use the word how a lot.
I didn't mean that to sound like trite,
Oh, no, no.
like who cares?
No, no, no.
But I do mean, there's some pretty big value because we use this all the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But again, there are plenty of people who want to read the Bible as a how book. Okay? You want to know how the world was created? Well, in 4004 BC, on the first day, God said, "Let there be light." Exactly. And when we wrestle with that question of literal interpretation, I have to start right away and say, okay, you read Genesis 1. On the first day, God said, "Let there be light." On the second day, third day, fourth day. All right. We get to start at chapter 2. Well, let me finish. Day 6, God creates male and female. God created them in God's own image. Chapter 2, Adam's first. Then all the animals, and none of them were a good fit for him. Finally, Eve. How do you reconcile those? I suppose you can go through some sort of gymnastics and say, it's just a different way of telling the same story. I don't think so. Because what we aren't doing in this series is unpacking, I will do a little bit. That first creation story probably dates from somewhere around 500 BC. Around 500 BC, 486, the temple's destroyed. A bunch of Israelites are dragged off to Babylon. Chaos. Our life is over as a religious people. Our temple's destroyed. Our city's destroyed. We're living in a foreign land. Psalm 137. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? A heartbreaking time. Chaos. Somebody needs to help us. Somebody needs to help this community feel like God's still in control. So God inspires whoever it's not Moses, I'm sorry. It's not Moses. To write a story about, in the beginning, when God began to create, the earth was without form and void. The Hebrew is tohu vabohu. I've told this story a bunch. When I was teaching this to confirmation kids, I had 38 kids in my room. I gave them each two black trash bags. I turned out the lights, and we went like this. Tohu, total confusion and emptiness, void, a mess. And what does God first do? He says, "Let there be light. And let the land appear. And let fish and birds." Every single day is a pushing back of chaos. Keeping in mind that for the Israelites, they weren't coastal people, they were inland. The sea scared them. It was a symbol of chaos, destruction. So when the first verse of the Bible talks about a watery chaos, we get it. And God began to impose order on that. And so reading that story in that time of chaos, we're going through chaos, but God's in control. God's going to restore order. That's the God who we worship, is the God who will restore order. That story is first, even though it's probably younger than the second story. But that's an example of how different stories end up in the Bible and why. Because God saw that the community needed to get a word of some kind, in this case, assurance that God is not a God of chaos and disorder, that God hasn't abandoned you. So that person was inspired to deliver that creation story in a way that really touched their hearts. Okay. The second story is a whole different. We won't spend time on going. Well, certainly we do, because the New Testament, of course, is the Jesus book, and we're Jesus people. But don't sell Isaiah short, and don't sell Moses short, and King David and his Psalms, they're pretty cool too. Well, that too, yeah. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. I got a story for you next time. I will not forget to tell you the story about Marcion. Yeah, he's good in that regard. All right. Any other comments, reactions? rebuttals. So next week, we're going to do the same story, but with the New Testament, and walk through that evolutionary process. So I invite you to responsibly pray with me as we close our time. Blessed Lord God, you have caused the Holy Scriptures to be written for the nourishment of your people. Grant that we may hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them. Comforted by your promises, may we embrace and forever hold fast to the hope of eternal life, which you have given us in Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. Did anybody else bring lunch? Okay, I know where to eat. No, Beth. Oh, that's fine. Oh, how's he doing?
So miserable, I didn't wanna like be like,
Oh,
so, yeah, they're all, and the
ah,
cause of it has bad side effects, which they didn't realize, and leaves a hurt taste in their mouth, and makes them restless.
oh,
So they're having everybody's having trouble sleeping,
ah,
so,
ah.
and, yeah. But they did finally get all their other stuff. So that was good. Did you have any trouble with whatever that squealing thing was? Did you try that?
Yes, and it was because this was on.
Oh.